The aim of this lecture is not to add another biography of Muhammad, peace be upon him, to the numerous ones already existing, but rather to study his life from a single aspect, the life of the Prophet as a preacher and messenger of faith. We certainly hope that the life of the founder of Islam and the initiator of its propagation will reveal the true character of the missionary activity of this religion. While the life of the Prophet serves as an example in the activity of an ordinary Muslim, it should also serve as an example for Islamic missionaries. Therefore, the life of the Prophet is a model upon which we hope to become acquainted with something concerning those who have adapted their activity to this example and the methods they are expected to adopt. In the following presentation, we want to show how the spirit of missionary work penetrated the faith from the very beginning, as it is not something new, invented in Islam, and then in what way the Prophet became an example for an Islamic missionary. Accordingly, besides the intention to write his history and describe the influences under which he grew to his maturity, and to present him as a statesman or military leader, our attention will be most drawn to his preaching. When, after prolonged internal conflicts and unrest, Muhammad, peace be upon him, received the conviction and duty with which he was inspired, his first efforts were directed towards convincing his family of the truthfulness of his faith. The oneness of God, the contempt for idolatry, the duty that obligates man to submit his will to the Creator, these were the simple truths he simply wanted them to follow. The first person to convert was his faithful and beloved wife Khadija, who 15 years earlier, when he successfully traded as her agent, had offered him her hand with the words, "I love you because you are my equal in lineage and tribe, and because the world respects you, and because of your honesty, the beauty of your character and the truthfulness of your speech." Khadija saved him from poverty, and gave him the opportunity to live in the social position that belonged to him by birth. But this material support from Khadija was nothing compared to her loyalty, spiritual support, and sympathy in his mental anguish, and she helped him with tender compassion and encouragement in his hours of depression. Khadija died in the year 619, 3 years before the Hijrah. Until this moment, during 25 years of married life, Khadija had always been ready to give him sympathy and encouragement when his enemies persecuted him and when doubts and fears tormented him. Ibn Ishaq, one of the writers of the Prophet's biography, says, "Thus Khadija believed and testified to the inspirations that came from God, and she helped him in his duty. Thus, the Lord was gracious to his messenger to lighten his burden, for whenever he heard something that saddened him, touched by the rejection of his people, he would return to her, and God would comfort him through her, because she would assure him and lighten his burden, and declare her faith in him, and make light of the people's belittling." Among the first believers were his adopted children, Zayd and Ali, and his trusted friend Abu Bakr, for whom in later years the Prophet would often say, "Throughout the many years of my call to faith, I did not find anyone who did not show astonishment, hesitation, and doubt except Abu Bakr. When I spoke of Islam, he neither marveled nor avoided his duties." Abu Bakr was a wealthy merchant, highly valued by his fellow citizens for his high morals, power, and clarity. After accepting Islam, he spent most of his wealth ransoming Muslim slaves who, because of their adherence to Islam, were subjected to torture by their masters. Under his influence, due to his great reputation, 5 of the earliest converts were added to the number of believers: Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, the future conqueror of Persia; Zubair ibn al-Awwam, who was also related to the Prophet and his wife; Talha, who would later be celebrated for his heroism; the wealthy merchant Abdurrahman ibn Auf, and the third Caliph Uthman. Uthman was the first to be subjected to violence. His uncle seized him and bound him, saying, "Do you prefer another religion more than that of your ancestors? I swear I will not release you until you abandon that new faith." To which Uthman replied, "I swear by the Lord, that I will never abandon this faith." When his uncle saw that he was so firm and committed to his faith, he released him. In the 3rd year of his mission, the Prophet managed to gather a group of followers around him, especially slaves and the poor. Encouraged by the success of these personal efforts, he took new measures and began to preach Islam publicly. He called his relatives to a meeting and invited them to embrace the new faith. No Arab, he said, has offered his nation more valuable principles than I have offered you. I bring you what will make you happy in this world and the next. Who among you will help me in this?" All were silent. Only Ali, with youthful enthusiasm, exclaimed, "O Messenger of God, I will help you." After this, the attendees began to disperse with mocking laughter. Muhammad, peace be upon him, did not give up his intention due to this failure, but addressed them whenever he had the opportunity. Yet his revelations and reminders resulted in nothing but ridicule and contempt. The Quraysh repeatedly approached Abu Talib, as the head of the Banu Hashim tribe to which Muhammad, peace be upon him, belonged, to dissuade him from further preaching against the religion of their ancestors, warning him that otherwise they would take harsh measures. After this, Abu Talib personally pleaded with his nephew not to bring misfortune upon himself and his family. "If they were to put the sun on my right hand and the moon on my left, if God did not allow me, I would not give up preaching. If I had to choose between my destruction and this, I would choose my destruction and not abandon my call," the Prophet replied. This moved Abu Talib, and he exclaimed, "Go and say whatever you wish. I swear by God, I will never surrender you to your enemies." The Quraysh followed the gradual spread of the new faith with indignation and hatred. They employed all possible measures, threats and promises, insults and offers of worldly honor and happiness to deter the Prophet from the path he had taken. It is said that this violent abuse to which he was subjected was an indirect reason for his uncle Hamza to side with him. When Hamza was told of all the humiliations to which his nephew was subjected, and the patience with which he endured them, his soul was filled with such compassion that from a fierce opponent, he became a zealous supporter. He was not the only example of sympathy for the suffering of Muslims that was shown in relation to the persecutions they had to endure, and, without a doubt, many secretly inclined towards the new faith, but did not declare it publicly until its final victory. So, the more the number of followers of this faith grew, the more bitter the hostility of the Quraysh became. They realized that the success of the new faith meant the destruction of the national religion and national worship, as well as the loss of power and wealth for the guardians of the Kaaba. Muhammad, peace be upon him, protected by Abu Talib and the Hashemites, was in a secure position. Indeed, although they did not feel love for the faith proclaimed by their relative, they still protected him from all attacks because of the strong tribal or kinship feelings characteristic of the Arabs. Except for the poor who had no protectors, and the slaves, they had to endure the most merciless persecutions and were imprisoned and tortured with the intention of being forced to renounce their faith. It was at this time that Abu Bakr bought the freedom of Bilal, an African slave, whom Muhammad had called the first fruit of Abyssinia. The idolaters brutally tortured Bilal. They would stretch him out on his back, then, placing large stones on his stomach, leave him lying for several days in the scorching sun. Then they would say to him, "Either you remain in this state until you die, or renounce Muhammad and worship the idols," and he would only repeat the testimony, "There is no God but Allah. There is no God but Allah." 2 individuals died in the torments they had to endure. Although a few wavered in their faith, these sufferings awakened even more enthusiasm in others, such as Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, who began to recite some verses from the Quran next to the Kaaba, a courageous act that none of Muhammad's followers had dared to do before. The Quraysh, who were gathered there, attacked and beat him, and some time passed before he was forced to stop reading. He returned to his companions. The next day he wanted to manifest his faith in the same way, but his companions dissuaded him from this intention, saying, "For you, this is enough, for you have made them hear what they absolutely do not want to hear." Probably due to the malicious treatment towards him, in the 4th year of his mission, the Prophet, peace be upon him, left his apartment and moved to the House of Arqam, one of the first converts. Since Arqam's house was in the center, many foreigners and pilgrims passed through there. To the passers-by who asked him, the Prophet could preach and explain Islamic rules here peacefully and without interruption. The Prophet's stay in this house represents an important period in the spread of Islam in Mecca, as many people converted to Islam after the Prophet began preaching in Arqam's house. Since Muhammad could not take his persecuted followers under his protection, he advised them to flee to Abyssinia, and in the 5th year of his prophethood, which was around 615 CE, 11 men and 5 women fled to Abyssinia, where they were well received by the Christian king there. Among these was Musab ibn Umair, whose conversion, really deserves attention because he endured bitter torments and was subjected to the hostility of those he loved and who once loved him. Hearing the preaching of the Prophet, peace be upon him, in the House of Arqam, he embraced Islam, only fearing that it would become known, as the members of his tribe and his mother, who loved him very much, were fierce opponents of Islam. And indeed, as soon as they discovered that he had embraced Islam, they seized him and imprisoned him, but he somehow managed to escape to Abyssinia. It is said that the hatred of the Quraysh followed the refugees even to Abyssinia. They sent a delegation to the king there to request the extradition of the Muslims, but the king, learning from the Muslims what had befallen them, refused to deprive them of protection. To the questions regarding their faith he received the following answer: "O noble king, we were plunged in the darkness of ignorance, we worshipped idols, we ate carrion, we committed various abominations, we severed kinship ties, we mistreated neighbors, and the stronger among us devoured the weaker. Such was our state until the Almighty sent us a messenger from among ourselves, whose lineage we know as well as we know his righteousness, trustworthiness, and the purity of his life. He called us to worship the one God and to abandon the stones and idols that our ancestors had worshipped instead of him. He commanded us to be truthful in speech, faithful in promises, merciful to parents, good to neighbors, to abstain from wrongdoing and bloodshed, and forbade us immoralities, lies, the usurpation of the rights of the poor, and the dishonoring of women. He obligated us only with the worship of God, with fasting and giving alms. We believed in him and began to follow what God revealed to us through the prophet, only that our fellow citizens rose against us and began to mistreat us in order to return us to idolatry and the abominations of our former life. Thus, because of their violent treatment of us and the bitter torments we endured, and because of interference in our faith, we left our homeland and fled to your land. Relying on your justice, we hope that you will not surrender us to the violence of our enemies." After these words, their request was granted, and the messenger of the Quraysh returned, bewildered. Although at this same time in Mecca, a new attempt was made to persuade the prophet to abandon his preaching activity, and in return he was promised wealth and honor. It was without success. While in Mecca, the result of the delegation that had gone to Abyssinia was awaited with great anticipation. The conversion of one person occurred, but such a person who later gave the first phase of Islam its most magnificent form, and who until his conversion was the most bitter enemy of Muhammad, peace be upon him, who with extreme fanaticism and stubbornness opposed Islam, so that he rightly deserved the Muslims to consider him their most formidable enemy. That person was Umar ibn al-Khattab. One day, seized by a sudden feeling of anger, he ran with his sword in hand to kill the prophet, peace be upon him. One of his relatives, meeting him on the way in this mood, asked him where he was going. "I am going to find Muhammad. I want to kill this apostate who has sown discord among the Quraysh, who considers them mad, and who wants to distort their religion and destroy the reputation of their idols," Umar replied. "Wouldn't it be better to dissuade your own relatives?" said the one who had asked him. "Which of my relatives?" "Your son-in-law said, and your sister Fatima have embraced Islam and become followers of Muhammad." As soon as Umar heard this news, he immediately went straight to his sister's house. His sister and her husband were sitting in the company of one of the Prophet's followers. This follower, named Khabab, was teaching Fatima and her husband to recite a chapter from the Quran. As soon as he arrived, Umar asked them about what he had heard them reciting. "Nothing," they replied. "What? I heard you, and I even learned that you have become followers of Muhammad." Saying this, he lunged at Saeed and began to beat him. Meanwhile, Fatima intervened, saying, "Yes, we are Muslims and we believe in God and his messenger. If you wish, kill us both." When Umar saw blood flowing from the face of his injured sister, a feeling of compassion awakened in him, and he asked to see what they had been reading. His sister, hesitating, handed him the page on which was the 20th chapter of the Quran Taha. After Umar read it, he exclaimed with joy, "Oh, how beautiful this is, how sublime!" While he was reading this, conviction overcame doubt, so that he exclaimed, "Take me to Muhammad so that I may profess my conversion to him." The conversion of Umar ibn al-Khattab to Islam represents a turning point in the history of Islam. After that, the Muslims were able to take a bolder stance. the Prophet left the House of Arqam, and the Muslims began to perform their prayers publicly around the Kaaba. It can be said that the nobility of Mecca became concerned about this behavior, as they had to deal with this group that lived in weakness but which, forming alliances not only with the oppressed but also with rulers, could threaten the existence of the current government and strengthen with the entry of prominent people into it. Accordingly, the Quraysh firmly resolved to stop the further spread of such a movement in this city. The Hashemites, who protected the Prophet because of kinship ties, were often excommunicated, as a result of which the remaining Quraysh decided to cut off all trade and marriage ties with them. It is said that the Hashemites, with the exception of the blessed months, remained isolated for 3 years. During these exceptional months, all disputes ceased in Arabia so that pilgrims from all tribes could visit the sacred Kaaba, which was the center of the national cult. Muhammad, peace be upon him, would use these periods, devoting himself to religious preaching among the members of the tribes who would flock to Mecca like torrents, and at the fairs in its vicinity. However, he was not very successful in this either, as his uncle Abu Lahab constantly followed him and loudly shouted, "He is a liar! He wants to dissuade you from the religion of your ancestors with some false rules. Do not listen to him. Avoid him." Then the members of the various tribes would greet him with the words, "Your people and your relatives know you better. Why don't they believe you?" The Prophet, peace be upon him, and his companions and relatives endured such hardships that in the end it provoked compassion in many of the Quraysh, so they ended that excommunication and boycott. In the same year, the Prophet, peace be upon him, was shaken and almost thrown into despair by the loss of his sincere wife Khadija, who had been his advisor and helper during their 20 years of married life. Shortly after, the death of his greatest and most steadfast protector Abu Talib once again exposed him to humiliation and attacks. The Prophet, peace be upon him, was subjected to humiliation by his fellow citizens, among whom he had preached for 10 years without significant success, so he decided to seek people who would be more easily persuaded to listen to him, and a place that would be more fertile for the seed of the new faith. With that hope, he set out for Taif, which is about 120 kilometers from Mecca. In this place, at the meeting of its inhabitants, the Prophet, as God's messenger, proclaimed the oneness of God and explained his teachings, and at the same time asked them for protection from those who persecuted him in Mecca. The disproportion between the great claims, which were fundamentally incomprehensible to the idolaters of Taif, and his misery and powerlessness in this regard was the reason why they mocked him and stoned him out of the city. After returning from Taif, the prospects for success were even dimmer. Muhammad, peace be upon him, was saddened by this and was in a similar situation to the prophet Noah, about whom it is said in the Quran. He, Noah, said, "My Lord, I have called my people night and day, but my call only made them flee further away. And every time I called them so that you might forgive them, they put their fingers in their ears, covered themselves with their garments, persisted obstinately, and acted very arrogantly." That's from chapter 71, verses 5 to 7.